Thank you, everybody, for attending our International Women's Day event today, shining a light on the cost of pay secrecy. Before we start, I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land on which we work and live. Our sovereignty has never been ceded, and the land we are on always was and always will be Aboriginal land. This International Women's Day, we are highlighting the importance of pay transparency to finance workers. International Women's Day 2020, and we're still talking about the gender pay gap, if you can believe that. And I just heard Peta say that the Morrison government says they fixed it. Yeah, right. Tell that to a finance worker where the gender pay gap is still at 29%. And I say that because many of you here today come from the sector, and you know that we have constantly had one of the highest gender pay gaps across all of the sectors. We take often the top prize, which is not a prize that you want. And while there are many factors that contribute to the emergence and the maintenance of the gender pay gaps, there's plenty of research that's been published across international economic literature which strongly suggests that the lack of pay transparency in organisations contributes significantly to the systemic underpayment of women. Our union has a really proud history of campaigning to close the gender pay gap, and more recently, we've focused, as I said, the campaign on the effects of pay secrecy. What happens when you gag workers? And I know that we've got an upcoming federal election, and I can't wait to hear from Peta in a moment on the politics of pay secrecy, because I think there is a clear fault line that has emerged on the issues facing women, their economic security and their safety, and you're either on this side or you're on that side, and I want to be on the right side when I think about how important those issues are as we talk to working people about them as they prepare to head to the ballot box. I know I said there's an upcoming federal election, but I just want to take you back to the last federal election just for a moment, and it's 2019, and we were all quietly confident that ALP would win office. So in anticipation of that, and knowing that the ALP's policy was to outlaw pay secrecy, we thought, let's write to all the major banks and say to them, you should stop using and enforcing the pay secrecy clauses because it's contributing to the gender pay gap. Having a big gender pay gap doesn't really match the things that you say about addressing the inequalities facing women in your organisation, and you actually have the biggest gender pay gap going. So why don't you just do away with these bad policies before the law changes, and you have to do with them then anyway. So do the right thing. Be a good leader and kind of lead on this. We only had one bank come back to us and say, we actually don't enforce pay confidentiality clauses, and that was the ANZ. Instead, CBA, Westpac and NAB all said, thanks, but no thanks. We're really happy with the way things are, and we're just going to keep maintaining our pay confidentiality clauses just as they are. Last year, when the RBA was asked by the House of Representatives Standing Committee on Economics if they had pay confidentiality clauses in their contracts, Governor Lowe said really quickly, oh, no, we don't have any such things. And it was in a short break that he came back later and corrected the record and said, I just found out we actually do have them. They're not good. And from today, our position has changed and we are not going to enforce them, and we're going to go back and tell the staff essentially straight up that they're gone. And that was a really good moment because it gave our campaign some great momentum, because when the other major bank CEOs then appeared, they were of course asked the same question about their pay secrecy practices, and they all said, let me go away and have a think about that practice and the policy. It doesn't sound like a good thing, but we don't have an answer for you today. So we took that opportunity and we wrote to each of them straight up, and we said, you've made a commitment to Parliament that you're going to reconsider. So here's a bunch of things that we think you should do straight away, and we'd like to know where you've landed. You've had some time to think about it. What do you think about these things now? And at the same time, our campaign was happening in the workplace, and we asked our members to also go digging around, have a look for some examples of what the bank is actually saying to workers today about your pay. And of course, we found two very contemporary examples of both the NAB and the Westpac that really helped us push those banks to the point where they have now come out to say that they won't enforce the gag clauses. There was plenty of material that was circulating where the bank was reinforcing essentially, this is what we're going to pay you as a bonus. Don't talk to anyone about it. That's what people were receiving at the same time that we were asking the bank about those things. So it's a good start, what we've achieved in some of the banks. that they're not going to enforce the gag clauses, but we just want them gone forever. Having them there, that in itself kind of perpetuates a culture that you really shouldn't talk about these things. Let me turn to what happened when the CBA CEO, Matt Comyn, appeared at the House of Representatives Committee. What he said about those clauses is that they're not enforced. And he'd commit to, whilst he wouldn't commit to removing them, in spite of saying, I don't think that it's a good policy, not one that you're going to enforce, it was soon after he made those comments that one of our members at the bank, at the CBA, was fired, can you believe, for talking about his pay with his colleagues. And as you can appreciate, as a room full of trade unionists here today, sacking a worker for asking about his pay was not something that we were going to tolerate and take lightly. So we took on the case, and it was reported in the press. And then another Senate committee asked the Commonwealth Bank about it, and the bank had to say, yeah, it was definitely one of the reasons why the employee was terminated. They essentially said it was, part of our consideration for why we sacked the worker. So we took the view that it really doesn't matter what the CBA says. They can say they don't sack people, but they actually do. But what we know is that the threats and the intimidation from your manager, if you talk about pay, is still a real threat. And it's still one of the reasons why we've got these negative outcomes when we think about pay equity. So we decided that we needed to really focus on the CBA. They were still holding out. And so we asked our members at the bank about their experiences of pay secrecy. And their experiences and their stories are told today in a report that we're launching. The report is titled "The Price of Silence, a Worker Perspective at CBA." And I think that we are going to be dropping a copy of that report into the chat. I want to acknowledge the contribution made by senior economist Alison Pennington, who you're going to hear from shortly, Dr. Jim Stanford from the Centre for Future Work, who validated our research. And in particular, they provided the estimates of the aggregate value of the gender pay differentials at the CBA. And what this report reveals is the lengths that the CBA will go to ensure that their workers stay silent about their pay. 95% of the CBA staff respondents believed that they must not talk about their pay, and 90% say that doing so would risk disciplinary action, even dismissal. So the CBA is the only major bank to not ban staff from discussing pay, and this ban allows CBA to pay some workers performing the same role much less than others. The report also found that women who make up the majority of CBA employees believe that they're being paid less, but they're really powerless to complain. They've got no ability to seek a pay review because don't forget, nobody's allowed to talk about pay. Nobody's allowed to talk about bonuses. So the effect of all of that is a gender pay gap at the CBA, which we say is worth, at the lower end, $500 million a year. That's $500 million that the bank is redirecting away from workers, and that they are essentially saving on their wages bill and redirecting back to them and the way in which they want to use that money. So I think it's really clear for everybody that the ban by the bank entrenches the gender pay gap. And given that the CBA can't see this as a problem, it's really time for the federal government to take action to outlaw confidentiality clauses. The Morrison government knows there's a problem, but they just refuse to do anything about it. They can and they should have outlawed these clauses, but they've chosen not to. So I'm really, really looking forward to hearing from our two keynote speakers today who are going to share their thoughts on this topic. What I'm going to do now is hand to you, Angela Budai, our National Policy Officer, who's going to facilitate today's event for us.
Thanks very much, Julia. So I just wanted to give you a bit of an overview about how today's event is going to run. So we've got two fabulous guest speakers who I'm going to be introducing in a moment. So firstly, we're going to hear from Alison Pennington, who's a senior economist at the Centre for Future Work. Then we're going to be hearing from Peta Murphy, ALP member for Dunkley. After we've heard from the two speakers, there will be some time for Q&A. And at the end of the Q&A, we're going to have a group activity in small groups facilitated by some FSU staff. If at any time you need to leave or you can't stay for the second part, that's absolutely fine, but we'd welcome you to stay because we've got some good stuff ahead of us. So firstly, Alison Pennington. She's the Senior Economist at the Centre for Future Work associated with the Australia Institute. Alison conducts research on economic issues facing working people, including the future of jobs, skills and training, collective bargaining and the role of government. Alison is a regular national media commentator on TV and radio, with writing published on platforms including The Guardian and The New Daily. Alison has previously held roles in public finance, public sector unions and music teaching. If you've been following the media in the last 24 hours, you will have seen and heard Alison talking about this very issue. When Alison's finished her speech, we're going to go straight into hearing from Peta Murphy. Peta Murphy is the first woman to represent the federal seat of Dunkley since her election in 2019. Prior to entering politics, Peta's career was defined by a commitment to social justice and strong communities. She worked in the Victorian justice system for a decade and a half, volunteered at her local community legal centre, was a solicitor advocate, a public sector defender at Victoria Legal Aid, a barrister and a team leader at the Victorian Law Reform Commission. After running as the Labor candidate for Dunkley in the 2016 election, Peta became Chief of Staff to the Honorary Brendan O'Connor MP, Shadow Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations in 2017. Peta has also served as a Director on the Board of Peninsula Health and a committee member of the Peninsula Waves VNL Club. Peta lives in Frankston with her husband Rod and two Labradors, Bert and Ernie. Peta is a member of the House of Representatives Economics Committee and has used her position to call for transparency from the Big Four banks. Peta is also a strong advocate for better behaviour and standards in politics. And if you followed any of the things that Julia was talking about earlier, Peta is one of those people who was questioning those bank CEOs. So I will now turn to Alison.
Thanks, Ange. Thanks for having me all. An absolute privilege to be with you here on International Women's Day, talking about a workplace control mechanism that disproportionately impacts women. So what I'll do is I'm going to walk you through the mechanics of the gender pay gap, how it relates to pay transparency, the conditions in which a lot of you are working under, and talk about more broadly about the question of pay equity and how we get it. I also bring the fire and rage of someone who has had the experience of being terminated for asking about my pay rates and talking about my pay rates with co-workers. It was an early experience for me in one of many insecure, low-wage, casual jobs I've had as a young person. But I was sacked when I was 18 in a shoe store for asking if my hourly pay rate was the same as someone else's. So I know what that the indignity and injustice of that experience is. And of course, like a lot of the pay secrecy culture and the norms are propagated around this idea of professionalism and what's professional and not. And what was very clear to me from that point on, and which fueled a lot of my interest that gets me to this point in life, is what's attached to pay secrecy is shame. It's basically the shame of disclosing the value that's being given to you by someone with far more power than you. So it is absolutely everything about women's economic security, because those with the power to determine the value of women's work are disproportionately men, and men in higher places. So that's the economics and the gender aspects tied in. I've got some visual aids to take you on this journey, and we should kick off. So we're talking about pay secrecy and it fueling the gender pay gap. How glad I am as a feminist who has an interest in the way the economy shapes women's working lives and their income security, to be away from the narrative that it is upon every woman individually to get that pay rise, to overcome those structural barriers, to back themselves in the boardroom. And so much of this narrative about what's been happening to women's pay has been based on a very responsibilizing, individualizing story. It's not about individual failings. We're talking about the way our structures are shaped and designed to screw women over. So the origins of the pay gap, where do they come from? We have to acknowledge from the start that while we've made massive progress since the second wave, particularly second wave feminist movement with women's access to paid work, Still, we have significant barriers for women to being able to fully participate in work because we have outdated social norms that say that women should perform the lion's share of unpaid care work, which they still do around double men's load, and of course, which has increased during the COVID pandemic. But something that's not adequately recognised is this isn't about just the division of unpaid care work between men and women, because we have the capacity to pay. Quite often, it's women in these professional roles. We have the capacity to pay for care services, but we have a government that continues to opt for high-cost, for-profit private care services, which often prices women out of being able to work to their full potential. And that's everything from early childhood care and education through to aged care and disability care. So women then, essentially, we're working two jobs, both the paid and the unpaid jobs, and being penalised for it by the time you get into the workplace. So women are disproportionately working in part-time, so lower hours jobs. 45% of all women are in part-time jobs. They're working lower paid jobs. And they are working jobs with less security, so more likely to be in casual work, less opportunities and respect on the job. The ideas about women's natural role, which are still very persistent, that is that women are secondary, their jobs as workers, paid workers are secondary to their natural jobs as unpaid carers. They're still very persistent, and those ideas, they follow women into the workplace. And that's the best way we can describe what is the significant levels of segmentation of jobs by industries and gender, and the undervaluation of that work. So Australia's labour market is among the highest levels of gendered segmentation in the OECD, where women are funneled into jobs that are considered women's work. So thinking particularly of feminised care services. And those jobs then are devalued and underpaid accordingly. 4 of 5 of the 5 lowest paying industries, according to average weekly earnings in the ABS, are all feminised. That is, they have 50% or more women. Then we also, on the other side of the spectrum, is the top 5 highest paying industries are all male dominated. That chronic undervaluation of feminised industries, the millions of women who are pooled, particularly in healthcare and social services, education, community social services, that is the largest driver of the pay gap, rather than the intra-firm pay gap. But the intra-firm pay gap is still significant. And this is where pay secrecy comes in. The way, now that we've got that background about all the structural barriers that women face to getting onto the job, which it means they come to the job in an inferior capacity. They're treated inferior on the job because they're treated inferior in broader society. And what pay secrecy provisions try to do is press the mute button on that structural discrimination, tries to pretend it doesn't exist and use the veneer of professionalism and what's compliant and in the best interest of the business to create this nature of quality of a professional worker. It is absolutely a tool of control. It's not a conspiracy to pay women less, but it's broadly a tool of workplace control. It brews fear and silence, cultures of fear and silence. And it has the impact of, by stopping people from being able to freely talk about their pay rates, it prevents the information being gathered that's necessary to effectively bargain and to put forward the case for your skills and your capacities. For women, this has a disproportionate impact on them because they are still in the process, clawing step by step to getting that respect and valuation in paid work, because it wasn't that long ago that women were cut out of being able to access, decent jobs and the experience of paid work. And if they come in already undervaluing under not having consciousness fully of their skills, if you whack pay secrecy on top of that, you have a recipe for opening up that intra-firm gender pay gap. So what's not always recognised is that the gender pay gap, it's commonly talked about at that 13.8% number, and that's one that the government recently pointed to as a slight narrowing and some sign of their great and glorious efforts for women in Australia. But that is, we're only looking at the difference between full-time ordinary earnings there, average earnings between men and women, full-time ordinary hours. But for industries like finance and insurance, where there are large compensation packages and additional performance bonuses that are built into how people are compensated, If you include that layer of pay and compensation, the pay gap widens out again to 16.4%. That's not a surprise because men are much more likely to be paid bonuses and higher additional salary compensation because they're more likely to also be in full-time work. But then again, if for the 45% of women workers who are in part-time jobs, who maybe many of which would like to do more work, this pay gap, those two first columns don't mean much to them, right? They are experiencing a pay gap with men on average that's more like 31%. And for any woman that's been in part-time work, that will make far more sense. Pay secrecy, it needs a vehicle, and we have to acknowledge that there's been a historic decline in the role of unions in our workplaces and the decline of collective pay setting through bargaining. So the relationship between union membership and bargaining has also been weakening, and alongside that has been individual contracts, the rise of individual contracts, particularly since the 1990s. To the point now where we have more employees in Australia paid according to individual contracts, 38% of all employees, with only 35% covered by collective agreements and 27% now paid according to minimum awards. The only way pay secrecy can survive and breathe is through individual contracts, because obviously collective bargaining and those agreements, by their very nature of making transparent all the different pay rates of people, they're antithetical to pay secrecy. I use the little picture there of the Matildas as an example of a male-dominated industry where women have come in and negotiated their higher pay rates. There is no way that they would have achieved some closing of the pay gap between male and female soccer players if they weren't transparent and open about what each were being paid in relation to men. So the decline of collective bargaining is a big reason behind the increasing use of pay secrecy. This is just one startling graph which shows since basically 2012, early 2013, the collapse of the number of collective agreements in the private sector and the number of employees that are covered by those agreements, to the point now where only 11% of private sector workers are covered by a collective agreement. So it's unsurprising with the power differential that is reproduced through pay setting, that the pay differences between men and women are greater when you're looking at individual contracts, and then they lessen as you move towards collective agreements and awards. So this would also suggest that collective pay setting and collective bargaining is in the interest of women workers over individual contracts. Moving to the finance and insurance services industry, which is your industry, it's one of the worst performing for the gender pay gap because of all of that extra additional compensation that's tacked on to, particularly onto full-time work and disproportionately to male workers. It's creating a two-tiered kind of internal labour market within these very large firms like the Commonwealth Bank. Women are 49% of all employment across the entire finance insurance services sector and are systematically paid less. 60% of all employees in the sector are paid according to individual contracts. I'd say that's a very high rate, and it's no surprise that there's a big pay gap. We have calculated at the Centre for Future Work that the value of the reduced compensation at just one firm, at the Commonwealth Bank, from the pay gap is valued close to $500 million each year. That's the lower estimate. The upper estimate is up to $800 million every year. And that it's extra compensation that is not being directed to women workers, that is being pocketed every year by very large profitable firms, which is going on to their shareholders or into other activities and investments. Pay secrecy, of course, is not the only measure that is behind the gender pay gap, but it is absolutely a massive contributor. And by creating a culture of secrecy and inability to counter that compensation gap, it helps that extra 500 to 800 million tick over as additional profit for the Commonwealth Bank every single year. The wider context for large behemoths like big banks is that they've never had it better. We're looking at a record high level profit share of GDP. It's now at the highest in recorded history. And The other side of that coin is that the share of national income of all the value being produced in our economy that is going to workers is also then at record lows. It's at 46% now, actually, in the latest ABS statistics. The pay secrecy, the gender pay gap, the reduced compensation that flows to women workers is absolutely a important and critical part of the story of the declining labour share of all GDP. Pay transparency is no silver bullet. If we are to outlaw secrecy, it wouldn't be the silver bullet to pay equity, but it's important in a range of measures for promoting pay equality. We need less silence in workplaces and more workplace democracy. And Australia is behind the 8 ball in regard to the avenues we provide for collective representation. I would suggest we need to look at sectoral bargaining systems to allow workers across an entire industry to bargain rather than at single enterprises. Pay equity is also about freeing up women to be able to work should they want to. That's about free childcare and affordable care services. We have to revitalise our award system to boost wages, particularly in those low-paid feminised sectors, expand paid parental leave to incentivise fathers and men to take more leave for care, and repair our superannuation system to pay super on leave and boost balances from absences. I'm just going to finish with one small point. I can see that I'm close to 15 minutes. Because when I was preparing this talk, I was thinking about why is it that women consistently undervalue their skills and come to the workplace believing that they don't belong in the future of work. And I, as someone at the Centre for Future Work, the name of the firm the place I work for, it's because so much of our narrative for many, many years has focused on a very male-dominated story about what are the skills that are going to be most valued in this future tech-heavy world. And that's been like a disproportionate focus on STEM skills, as well as coding and like hard tech skills. But actually, all of the evidence shows, both in reality and in forecasting for the future, it's going to be actually those flexible communication, critical thinking skills, teamwork. These are the capacities that are actually in high demand now and will be in high demand in the future. And I think this is a big reason why women, they write out themselves from that picture of the future of work. I'm going to leave you with this graph, which is the government's own projections about the industries that are going to produce the most jobs in the 5 years to 2025. You can see very clearly that we are looking at both feminised industries, healthcare and social assistance, accommodation, food services, professional, scientific, technical services, education, training. Construction is the only male-dominated industry there. It is feminised industries that are going to be the fastest growing and in highest need. And the skills clearly that they are already bringing to the table in those industries are the ones that will be part of the future. So jobs with those high human labour inputs are those in highest demand. It's the hard skills that are going to be marginal in the future of work. Women are a growing share of the workforce. We continue to march towards women's greater participation in work. They are the majority of union members now, something that is often overlooked. And it means that the fight to value women's skills and lift their pay is the future of unionism in Australia. Thank you.
Well, I've been asked, hello everyone, I'm Peta. I've been asked to jump right in after Alison. I must admit I was both grateful and a little bit worried about Alison going before me. Grateful because she's the expert on all of this. And I want to start by saying International Women's Day, break the bias. Alison has done an amazing job at becoming an incredibly well-respected voice on these issues, on industrial relations, in particularly on the labour market, and a go-to researcher and commentator in a field that has traditionally been, and let's face it, continues to be, so dominated by men. So Alison, I haven't had the chance to say this to you privately or publicly, but I have been watching, like everyone else, everything that you've been doing, and you really are quite a trailblazer and very impressive. So I'm grateful to go after you because I don't have to pretend to be the expert, but it's a pretty hard act to follow. And as you can see, because I'm a politician, I don't have PowerPoint. I have hands that I wave around. I would say I'm not going to talk for 15 minutes, but every time I say that, I talk for 20. And what I mean to say is I'm not going to talk for 10. I'm really quite flattered to have been invited to be part of this Zoom today by the FSU, and it is such an important issue, gender equality most widely across society, and particularly in the workplace. And it is terrific to see the FSU, as they have been for a very long time, being at the front of the campaign for pay equity. My very rough brief was to sort of talk about the political pressure and where things are politically on this. I'm sure that most of you who have taken the time to be part of this Zoom are pretty well apprised of where we're at, but bear with me. This is my detailed plan for my speech. I have made some notes on this, and some of it you will know. There may be some things that you don't. I just wanted to pick up where Alison left off a little bit about the future of work. And it is an interesting, I think, conundrum that, as she says, the future of work is actually going to be those skills that women are most known for, collaboration, working together, innovation in thinking, the more soft skills. And that's terrific. And we can only hope that those economic theories, which haven't been working very well lately, but which say more demand for industries which women work in will lead to greater pay for those industries, come true. But there's also, as I say, I think the conundrum is we actually do want to break the bias, the theme of International Women's Day, and also acknowledge, sure, we are great at all those things. And let's face it, sorry, men on the Zoom, but we are better than men at much of that communication and collaboration side of things. But women are also really good at the hard skills, are actually really good at the STEM work and the research work, and could also, if given the opportunity, be incredibly good at some of the physical labour work. It's just that we haven't been given the opportunities to do that over the decades or the centuries, but particularly the decades. And that women who are good in those areas are sort of seen as exceptional or lauded as, a one-off. And the bias is the assumption that women will continue to be the drivers of the care economy, because, as Alison also pointed out, that's been seen historically as women's work, even though it now can be part of paid work. And men will continue to be seen to be the leaders in the financial services sector, because men are always, have been so good at it, but they've been the wolves of Wall Street, and done all of that work. So I join with, Alison's analysis of it's going to be great that female-dominated industries are actually going to be in demand, but I actually would like to see those industries not being as female-dominated, because we're also doing work in other industries. I'm going to get to pay secrecy clauses, but I just thought I'd talk about some of these things first, because one of the issues, of course, one of the reasons why we want to do away with pay secrecy clauses is that gender pay gap. And I agreed this morning because I am slightly crazy, and let's face it, in the end, I'm a politician, so it's great to be on the radio, but to be on local ABC radio for International Women's Day, having a discussion about where women are at in politics and the workplace, with Sarah Henderson, the Liberal Senator for Victoria, who, if anyone's heard Sarah speak, will know why I say it like Sarah Henderson. And I started off I thought it was a friendly chat, so I didn't talk about politics, but I talked about the gender pay gap, and it, having been sort of stubbornly between 14 and 20% for a very long time. And of course, that in Australia, we've fallen from, last time Labor was in government, number 24 on the World Economic Forum gender gap ratings to 50, which is our worst ever result. And Sarah's response, if you can believe this, was that the Morrison government has reduced the gender pay gap because of their policies. And no mention of stagnant wages, and that the suppression of wages has hit the high-paid industries, which are male-dominated, which has had a significant impact on that gender pay gap being reduced. And it seems to me that that's indicative of what Labor's opponents, what the Liberal Party, the approach they take to these issues is when things change really because of circumstance or bad impacts of their policies, and there might be some good consequences, they like to take credit for it. Just like I noticed in the ABC coverage of the terrific report that Alison wrote and the FSU put together about pay secrecy in the CBA, that the response from the well-known feminist Michaelia Cash was that there are more women in full-time work than ever before because of the Morrison government. Well, newsflash, there's more women than ever before as well. And if there weren't more women in full-time work than ever before, then there would be an even bigger problem than there currently is. But their response also, I thought, was pretty telling when they said that the inclusion of pay secrecy clauses in employment contracts is a matter for the contracting parties, and that some representatives of employers were concerned that banning pay secrecy clauses would harm business competitiveness, especially if workers could not be stopped from discussing wages because it could undermine the ability of an organisation to manage workplace performance. I just think that's code for saying that it would stop businesses from being able to pay those they want to pay more. They would not be able to organise their business with their conscious or their unconscious bias, where the people that look and sound and act like the people who are in charge, which are usually middle-aged white men, get valued more than the people who look different, women of colour and people of colour. And as Alison said, when more and more of our workplaces are covered by employment contracts and not by collective bargaining, it makes it even easier. So politically, it's pretty difficult to get change from opposition. And I will tell you briefly at the end of this some of Labor's policies that we're committed to if we form government, which you probably know. But I did want to touch on what's been mentioned, is that there are ways that we can make change even when we've got a government that puts up barriers. And I was asked, I can't remember because it's COVID, right? And time is very hard to judge anymore, but I'm going to say maybe just over a year ago, 18 months ago, to join the House of Representatives Economics Committee. You heard my Wikipedia page earlier. It's not because I've worked in the finance sector. It's not because I'm a renowned economist. It's not because I'm a female Andrew Lee and write a book every 20 seconds and do world-leading research while also being in Parliament. I think it was because I've been a barrister and I have some capacity to ask questions, and they thought that perhaps a woman might be better at taking on Tim Wilson than a man. So I had to think about how I was going to approach being on that committee with all of those enormous male egos, and the only two women being myself and Celia Hammond, the Liberal member for one of the Perth seats, who whilst is in the Liberal Party is actually a pretty decent person and quite thoughtful. So I decided to focus, generally speaking, on two issues. One is climate change and how the finance and economic and superannuation sector are actually leading the government with investment. And the other was gender parity. And so it was very helpful that, of course, the FSU are also onto this issue. So the questions that were asked in the Senate Economics Committee, Andrew Lee, because he's a great ally, lets me pretend I was the first person to ask Philip Lowe about pay secrecy clauses, but it was actually Andrew who asked that question. And then I just did some cleanup at the end to get him to confirm that they wouldn't rely on it. But that genuinely changed policy in the Reserve Bank. And I think also, in addition to the work the FSU has been doing, genuinely put pressure on the big four banks to have to publicly, when they came up for the hearings next time, and I was the lead person asking all of the questions, admit that the research is clear that pay secrecy clauses has an impact on the gender pay gap. And having led them all to talk about how wonderfully committed they are to reducing the gender pay gaps in their organisations and doing work to do so, it was a pretty small step to publicly then have them commit, even if they haven't done it in practice, but to commit publicly to dealing with pay secrecy clauses. So I think it was an example of how you can do things when you campaign and people work together. I think it's also a pretty practical example of why transparency and things being out in the open is so important, because they wouldn't have made those commitments if they weren't being questioned in a public forum and held to account on the record. Now, we know that professions, particularly when it comes to some of our banking and financial institutions of good intentions, don't always lead to good outcomes. So a federal Labor government committed, as you heard last election, and it is not one of the policies that we are not taking forward. We are absolutely committed to amending the Fair Work Act to prohibit pay secrecy clauses being in enterprise agreements and make it a workplace right. So actually make it an affirmative workplace right to be able to talk about your pay and conditions in the workplace. And we know that one of the reasons why that is beneficial to women is that, sadly, but it is the fact, we underestimate our value compared to men when we are negotiating many things, but particularly pay. And it is much more common, research says, for a man to pitch for a higher pay grade out of confidence rather than necessarily qualifications and experience, and a woman to say, oh, well, maybe I'm not quite good enough, so I'll pitch a bit lower. And knowing what the pay scales are that people are on makes it much easier to say, I do the same job as that person, I get better outcomes than that person, this is actually what I'm worth. So we will make that not just prohibited, but a workplace right. And I won't talk for much longer. I'm happy to do the Q&A. But many of the things that Alison talked about, which are either barriers to getting rid of or reducing the gender pay gap, or ways to reduce it, we have also committed to. And one of the things I'm very proud of as a staffer and now in Parliament, hoping to be part of implementing, is Labor's policies about equal remuneration processes in the Fair Work Commission, and making equal pay an objective of the Fair Work Act, and looking at establishing a specific unit within the Fair Work Commission for equal remuneration proceedings and hearings, and making that serious, and getting rid of the male comparator requirement. I think that will make a big difference to many of those low-paid care jobs, and even the higher paid financial services jobs. To increase the requirement for gender pay gap reporting of organisations, and reduce the number of employees organisations have to have before they have to report their gender pay gap. Again, transparency, sunlight makes a big difference. And I note that the other thing Michaelia Cash, the spokesperson, said is that the Morrison government have measures in place for gender pay gap reporting. Well, they sort of do. They're the ones that the previous Labor government introduced, and they haven't been able to get rid of. So that's a bit of an overview of where things are politically. I would like to be able to tell you that our pressure is going to lead to some sort of bipartisan approach to these issues, but I just don't think they will, because we take a very different approach to workplace issues than our opponents. And my political pitch to all of you is that if this is something that you care about in your workplace and more broadly, the way to get it changed is to elect a Labor government where you've got Tanya Plibersek as the Minister for the Status of Women, and Tony Burke, Industrial Relations Minister, and Peter Murphy MP doing whatever job Albo lets her do, but hopefully being part of that team. So there you go. There's my overview. I hope that touched on some of the things that you guys wanted, and I'm happy to answer questions until my staff take me away to my next event.
Fabulous. Thank you, Peta, and thank you, Alison, for some fabulous presentations.